Good evening, wherever you're listening from tonight, and welcome to the Sleepy History. I'm glad you're here. Before the sun had fully risen over the Nile, before the first boat pushed away from the muddy bank, a house was already waking in the smallest of ways. Not with noise, not with hurry, but with the soft sounds of an ordinary morning. A stone floor, still cool from the night, a single oil lamp burning low in a corner, and near a sleeping mat resting in the grey half-light, a small clay jar of oil waiting to be warmed between two hands. This is where our story begins tonight. Not in a palace, not on a battlefield, but in a quiet room at the gentle hour when a body first stirs. If you find this kind of slow, quiet journey into the ancient world soothing, you're very welcome to stay a while. Feel free to subscribe if you'd like to drift off to more stories like this one, and to gently like the video if it's helping you relax tonight. And if you feel like it, leave a comment and let me know where in the world you're listening from. It's a lovely thing to imagine all these quiet rooms scattered across so many places, all settling into the same story. Now, let's return to that small clay jar and to the morning it belonged to. When we think of ancient Egypt, our minds often reach first for the enormous things, the pyramids rising from the desert, the great stone temples, the golden mask of a young king staring out across 3,000 years. These are the images that fill the museums and the school books, and there is a reason they endure. They're astonishing, but they're also, in a quiet way, misleading. They tell us about the few, about kings and queens, priests and scribes, the powerful and the remembered. They tell us very little about the morning we are sitting in right now, in this modest room, where someone is simply reaching for a jar of oil. Because for most people who ever lived along the Nile, life was not made of monuments. It was made of mornings like this one, of waking, of washing, of tending to the body before the heat of the day arrived. And in ancient Egypt, that tending was never a small or careless thing. Caring for the body was woven deeply into what it meant to live well, to be respectable, to be ready to face other people and, in many beliefs, to face the gods themselves. A person who was clean, oiled, and ordered was a person who was, in some sense, whole. We should be careful here, as we will be throughout our journey tonight. The lives of ordinary Egyptians must often be reconstructed carefully, pieced together from tomb paintings, from objects left behind, from scattered records that survived by chance. Much of what was written down came from the wealthy, the literate, the elite, and their world was not everyone's world. What a farmer's family in a small village did each morning may have looked quite different from the routines of a fine house in the city. Depending on class, on region, on the century in which a person lived, the details would shift. So we hold these images gently, as glimpses rather than certainties. And yet, across all those differences, something shared seems to run through it all. A wish to feel clean, a wish to soften dry, sun-worn skin, a wish to begin the day feeling cared for, even in the smallest way. That warm jar of oil resting on the cool floor sat at the very centre of this. It was one of the first things many hands reached for at dawn, and one of the last they returned to at night. So the question that quietly rises as the lamp flickers and the room slowly fills with grey morning light is a simple one. Why did this matter so much? Why did washing and oiling the body carry such weight in this ancient world? To understand that, we have to look a little closer at what cleanliness truly meant to the people who lived here. The question we left with was a simple one. Why did washing and oiling the body matter so much in this ancient world? To find the answer, we have to set aside the idea that cleanliness was only about comfort or appearance, and step into a way of thinking where the clean body meant something larger. In ancient Egypt, to be clean was in many settings to be right. Right with oneself, right with one's neighbours, and right with the unseen powers that were believed to shape every day. For those who served in the temples, this was not a gentle preference, but a strict discipline. Priests' records suggest washed carefully and often, sometimes several times across a day and night, before they could approach the sacred spaces and the images of the gods. Purity of the body was believed to mirror purity of the spirit, and to enter a holy place unwashed was to bring disorder into a place meant for perfect order. Some shaved their bodies, kept themselves scrupulously clean, and dressed in fresh linen, all so that nothing impure would stand between them and the divine. But this was only one kind of life, lived by a small and privileged few. In an ordinary household, cleanliness looked quieter and simpler. shaped less by grand ritual and more by the plain realities of living in a hot land. Water was poured from a jug rather than drawn from a fine basin. Washing happened in a corner of the home, or at the river's edge, or wherever the day allowed. The gesture was humbler, but the wish behind it was much the same. To rinse away the dust and sweat of labour, to feel refreshed, to begin again. And this is where the public expectation and the private routine gently meet and part. In the temples, cleanliness was a matter of law and duty, watched over and demanded. In the small home, it was a matter of habit, of care, of doing what could be done with what one had. The same value flowed through both, but it took very different shapes depending on class, on place, on the resources a family could spare. We should be careful not to imagine every Egyptian scrubbing several times a day like a temple priest. For most, cleanliness was woven into ordinary life in ordinary ways as time and water allowed. Still, there is something touching in how consistent the underlying feeling seems to have been. To be clean was to be presentable, to be respectable, to hold one's small place in the world with dignity. A person who kept themselves washed and tended was signalling without a word that they were part of things, that they belonged. In a society where appearance and order carried real social weight, this quiet grooming was a language everyone could speak, whether they were wealthy or poor. We should hold all of this loosely, of course. The evidence that survives leans heavily toward the elite, toward temples and fine houses and the people who could afford to leave records behind. The daily washing habits of a poor family in a distant village are far harder to see, and much of it we can only imagine with caution. Not every person had the same water, the same privacy, the same time to spare. What we can say is that the idea of cleanliness as something meaningful, something tied to faith and to belonging, seems to have run broadly through this world, even if it was lived out in 1,000 different ways. So the clean body was never quite just a clean body. It was a small statement about a person's place in the order of things, made freshly each morning with a little water and a great deal of quiet meaning. Damp linen, cool droplets, the soft shadows of dawn stretching across a floor. These simple things carried more than they seemed to. And all of this happened somewhere, in rooms, in corners, in courtyards and doorways, in the physical spaces where daily life unfolded. To understand these morning routines a little better, we should step now into those rooms themselves and see the quiet places where each day truly began. So let us step now into those rooms, quietly, the way you might enter a house at dawn while its people are still stirring. In much of ancient Egypt, the ordinary home was built of mudbrick, shaped from the very earth of the riverbank and dried under the sun. These were not grand structures. Walls were thick to hold back the heat, doorways were often low, and the rooms inside could be small and dim, lit by whatever light slipped through narrow openings or an open doorway. A woven mat on the floor, a wooden stool, a few clay vessels resting in a niche in the wall. This was the setting where many mornings began. We should picture these homes carefully and without romance. For a large family, space could be tight. Rooms served many purposes at once, shifting through the day from sleeping to cooking to working. Privacy, as we think of it now, was often a luxury few could expect. And yet, even in a crowded and modest home, there was usually a corner that belonged to the morning ritual, a place where the water jar stood, where the small jar of oil waited, where a person could pause, however briefly, to tend to themselves before the day pulled them outward. In wealthier households, the picture was different, though not entirely so. A fine house might have several rooms, cooler and better arranged, with dedicated spaces for washing and for storing the oils, linens, and cosmetics that filled a comfortable life. Some had raised areas or slabs where a person could stand to be washed, the water carried away through simple drainage. Servants might tend to these tasks, warming the oil, laying out fresh linen, keeping the little vessels in order. Here, the morning routine could be slower, gentler, more elaborate. But here is the quiet thread that runs between them. Whether in the cramped corner of a labourer's home or the airy room of a prosperous house, the same essential wish was being answered. The wish to wake, to wash, to feel ordered and ready. The comforts differed enormously, shaped by wealth, by space, by the number of hands available to help. Yet the human impulse behind the routine was shared across every threshold along the street. Rich and poor alike reached for water and oil at the start of the day, even if what they reached for, and where they reached for it, looked very different. We should be cautious, as always, about how much we can truly know. The fine houses of the well-off have left us more to study, their rooms better preserved, their objects more likely to survive. The humble mud-brick homes, rebuilt and worn away over centuries, tell us far less. Much of ordinary domestic life must be reconstructed carefully, from fragments, from the occasional excavated village, from objects whose exact use we can only guess at. What survives leans toward the comfortable, and we must remember that when we imagine these rooms. Still, even the fragments are enough to feel the shape of it. A small niche in a wall worn smooth where jars once sat, a stool polished by years of use, a doorway opening onto a courtyard where morning light gathered and warmed the packed earth. These are human-scale things, the quiet furniture of daily life, and they connect us to the people who moved among them more directly, perhaps, than any monument ever could. A room tells you how a life was actually lived, in a way a temple rarely can, and within these rooms, resting in their niches and waiting in their jars, were the oils and creams that stood at the heart of it all. We have spoken of them in passing, of that small warm jar reaching toward the morning. But we have not yet asked what these oils truly were, or why, in a land of sun and dust and dry wind, they mattered so deeply to the skin. So from the rooms themselves, we turn now to what those rooms held, and to the harsh climate that made such simple care not a luxury, but a quiet necessity. To understand why a small jar of oil mattered so much, you first have to feel the land it belonged to. Egypt was a place of extraordinary sun. For much of the year the light fell hard and bright, and the air away from the river ran dry as old paper. Wind carried fine dust from the desert into everything, into homes, into clothing, onto skin. And skin, exposed to such a climate day after day, does not stay soft for long. It tightens, it roughens, it cracks at the knuckles and the heels, it ages before its time. This was not a distant discomfort for a few. It was a daily reality that touched nearly everyone who lived and worked beneath that sun. And so oiling the body was first and foremost a practical answer to a practical problem. The oil was a shield. Worked into the skin, it slowed the drying, eased the cracking, and kept the body supple against the harshness of the air. It soothed the sting of sunburned shoulders and the roughness of wind-worn hands. For a farmer bending in the fields, for a builder hauling stone, for a woman carrying water back and forth beneath the midday heat, this simple act offered real relief. It was comfort, yes, but it was also protection, a small defense against a climate that never softened for long. Here we can feel the gentle contrast at the heart of it. On one side, the hardship of the land itself, the relentless sun and the dust and the dryness that wore the body down. On the other, the small comfort of soothed skin, of a body cared for and eased at the end of a long day. The oil sat exactly between these two things, a quiet answer to a hard world. It could not change the sun, but it could change how the sun was carried on the skin. We should be careful, though, not to imagine that every person met this need in the same way. The oil a household could reach for depended greatly on its means, on where it lived, on the season and the century. A prosperous family might have finer oils, more of them, and hands to apply them gently. A poorer family made do with what was cheap and available, using it sparingly, saving it for when the skin most needed it. The wealthy could treat oiling as a slow pleasure. For the labourer, it might be a quick, necessary rub before sleep, worked into aching hands by lamplight. The need was shared. The way it was answered was not. And yet there is something quietly moving in that shared need. The great and the humble alike lived in the same climate, under the same sun, and their skin responded to it in the same human way. A queen and a field worker both knew the feeling of dry, tight skin at the end of a hot day, and both, in their different manners, reached for oil to ease it. This is the kind of small, bodily truth that connects us across all the centuries between. The monuments divide people into rulers and subjects, the remembered and the forgotten. But the simple ache of sun-worn skin and the relief of oil upon it belong to everyone. So oil was never a frivolous thing in this land. It was woven into survival and comfort both, a daily necessity dressed in the gentle language of care. To be without it for those who could not easily afford it was to feel the climate more sharply. To have it was to hold a small measure of ease against a hard world. But what exactly were these oils? Where did they come from? How were they stored? And why did they hold such steady value in Egyptian life? To understand the care itself, we must first look closely at the substance at its center. So we turn now from the need to the oils themselves. So what were these oils, the ones that eased so many tired bodies at the end of the day? They were not, for the most part, the rare and precious substances we might imagine. The oils of ordinary life came from the land itself, pressed and rendered from plants and animals that were near at hand. Among the most common was castor oil drawn from the beans of a plant that grew readily in Egypt, thick and practical and widely used. There was moringa oil, valued for its lasting quality, and various vegetable oils and animal fats that served the everyday needs of the skin. These were the workaday oils, the ones most people knew. Above these sat the finer things, the costlier oils and imported balms that came from farther away, carried along trade routes and valued accordingly. Fragrant resins and scented preparations, softer and more pleasant to the touch, belonged more often to those who could afford them. Here again we meet that quiet contrast. On one side, the plain castor oil in a labourer's simple jar, useful and unglamorous. On the other, the rare imported balm resting in a fine vessel in a wealthy home, a small luxury that spoke of means. The same basic act, the oiling of skin, could be humble or refined depending entirely on who was doing it and with what. These oils were kept with care because they mattered. They were stored in clay jars and sealed vessels, tucked into cool niches away from the worst of the heat, measured out rather than poured freely. A wooden spoon or a small dipper might be used to lift out just what was needed. The faint scent of plant oil would have hung about these storage corners, mingling with the smell of clay and dust. To waste oil was to waste something of real worth, and people handled it accordingly, with the quiet frugality of those who understood its value. And its value was genuine, not merely sentimental. At places such as Deir el Medina, records from particular periods show workers receiving essential supplies and rations, including ointment or oil alongside food and other necessities. This does not describe every worker in every century, but it reminds us that such substances could be treated as practical provisions rather than idle luxuries. A small jar could therefore carry the value of useful work, household need, and bodily comfort all at once. There is a gentle dignity in that. It reminds us that care of the skin was not necessarily treated as an idle pleasure. In some communities, oil or ointment could be counted among the useful provisions that help sustain working lives. We might picture a tired worker rubbing a small amount into cracked hands by lamplight, drawing a little comfort from something practical, valuable, and carefully used. We should be careful, of course, not to overstate the comfort of such lives. The work was hard, the rations were modest, and the evidence we have leans towards certain places and periods rather than all of Egypt across its long history. Not every worker in every age was provided for in the same way. But the broad picture holds a quiet warmth. Oil and ointment could stand close to the practical necessities of ordinary life. They were pressed from familiar materials, kept carefully in humble jars, measured out with respect, and in some documented communities and periods included among the provisions distributed to workers. Behind the grand image of ancient Egypt, its temples and its kings, there was this simpler truth running steadily through countless ordinary days. And once the oil was lifted from its jar, warmed a little between the hands, it was time to apply it to the skin. This was its own quiet moment, sometimes hurried, sometimes slow and almost tender. So from the oils themselves we turn now to the gentle ritual of anointing, and to the small pause it offered within a long and demanding day. There is a particular quiet that settles over a person tending to their own skin. The hands slow, the breath softens, attention narrows to the small warmth of oil spreading across an arm, a shoulder, the back of a weathered hand. In ancient Egypt, the act of anointing the body could be exactly this kind of moment, a gentle pause carved out of an otherwise demanding day. The oil was lifted from its jar, warmed a little between the palms, and worked slowly into the skin. And in that working, something more than the skin was being tended. There was a settling of the whole person, a brief return to oneself. For those with the time and the means, anointing could be a leisurely thing. In a comfortable home, it might happen by the soft light of a lamp, the oil already warmed, perhaps applied by the careful hands of another. There is an intimacy in being tended to in this way, in the quiet trust of letting someone smooth oil across tired shoulders. It was care given and received, a small ritual of belonging within a household. The scent of the oil, faint and warm, would have lingered in the room afterward, marking the moment as something apart from the ordinary rush of the day. But we should not imagine every anointing as slow or gentle. For the labourer, the field worker, the woman who had carried water and ground grain since before dawn, the moment was likely briefer and plainer. A quick rub of oil into cracked hands before sleep, a hurried working of it into sunburned skin by the last light of an oil lamp. The unhurried, meditative version of this ritual, the kind we might picture most easily, was surely rarer for those whose work never seemed to end. Their care was no less real, but it was pressed into the narrow margins of an exhausting day, taken where it could be found. And here lies a soft contrast worth pausing on. There is the loneliness of a solitary evening, a tired person alone in a dim room oiling their own aching hands with no one to help or witness. And there is the warmth of belonging, of being tended by another, of a shared and gentle moment within a household. Both were real, both existed side by side across this ancient world. The same simple act, the same jar of oil could carry either solitude or closeness, depending on the life it belonged to. We cannot know, for most people, which it was. We can only hold both possibilities gently. What seems clear is that the anointing did something for the mind as much as the body. To stop, even briefly, to attend to oneself with care, is a quietly restorative act. It marks a boundary between labour and rest, between the demands of the world and the small territory of the self. Whether done alone in weary silence or shared in the soft light of a comfortable room, the ritual offered a pause, a breath, a moment of being cared for, and that, perhaps, is something we still recognise in ourselves. All these centuries later, when we tend to our own tired bodies at the end of a long day, we should keep our caution close, as always. The evidence for these private moments is thin and uneven, gathered from objects, from images, from the practical logic of how people lived. The inner experience of anointing, what it truly felt like to those who did it, is something we can only imagine with care. Much of it is lost, but the objects remain, the jars and the traces of oil, and they let us reach, however gently, toward those quiet moments. Yet oil did more than soften and soothe. When the skin was not merely dry but hurt, when there were wounds to tend, bites to ease, aching muscles to comfort, people reached for something more than plain oil. They reached for salves and remedies, mixtures made in hope of healing. So from the gentle care of the skin's surface, we turn now to the tending of its hurts and to the quiet meeting place of beauty, medicine, and hope. Not every ache could be soothed by plain oil alone. When the skin was broken, when an insect's bite swelled and itched, when muscles ached from a long day of carrying and bending, people reached for something more. They reached for salves and ointments, thicker preparations mixed with hope as much as with knowledge. In these small stone dishes and clay pots, the line between beauty, medicine, and comfort blurred and softened, until it hardly seemed a line at all. To tend the body was to tend all of it, its dryness and its hurts alike. Egyptian remedies drew on the things they had. Honey, prized for reasons we now partly understand, since it does carry genuine properties that can help a wound stay clean. Crushed herbs and plant matter, ground and blended into fats and oils. Various substances whose uses were passed along through practice and belief. These would be worked together into a salve and pressed gently onto the skin, sometimes covered with a strip of soft linen. The making of them had its own quiet craft, a careful measuring and mixing, hands moving over a small dish in the lamplight. Some of these remedies, we can now say, likely did real good. Honey upon a wound was not mere superstition. But we should be honest and careful here. Many treatments surely did little, and some may have done harm, and the reasoning behind them mixed sound observation with belief in ways that are hard for us to separate now. The evidence is incomplete, drawn from medical texts that survived by chance and from the objects left behind. We cannot assume that what was written down was always what was practiced, nor that it worked as intended. Healing in this world was a matter of hope as much as knowledge. And here lies the quiet contrast at the heart of it. In public, in the confident language of the healers and the written remedies, there was an air of certainty, a sense that this mixture treated that ailment, that this salve would ease that hurt. But in the private moment of applying it, in the tired person pressing honeyed salve onto a wound and waiting through the night, there must often have been uncertainty. Would it help? Would the swelling ease by morning? That gap between the confidence of the remedy and the quiet not knowing of the sufferer is deeply human, and it has not really changed across all the centuries between them and us. We should also remember that healing depended greatly on who a person could reach. In a comfortable household, a knowledgeable healer might be summoned, remedies prepared with care, the sick tended by attentive hands. For a poor family in a distant village, help was whatever a neighbour knew, whatever herbs grew near, whatever old wisdom had been handed down. The same ailment could be met with skilled attention or with little more than hope, depending entirely on one's place in the world. Comfort in illness, like comfort in health, was unevenly shared. Yet through all of it runs that same tender impulse we have followed all along, the wish to ease suffering, the wish to care for a hurting body, whether one's own or another's. The healer's careful hands over a small dish, the strip of linen laid gently across a wound, the honey glowing amber in the lamplight. These are images of tenderness, of people doing what they could with what they had, reaching toward healing even when they could not be sure of it. So we have followed the care of the skin from its everyday oiling to the tending of its hurts, and everywhere we have found the same quiet dignity. But the body is more than its skin, and Egyptian care reached toward other parts of the self as well. Perhaps nowhere is this clearer, nowhere more familiar to our own eyes than in the way they tended their eyes. That dark, distinctive line around the eye is one of the most recognizable images this ancient world has left us. So from the skin, we turn now to the painted eye, and to the surprising reasons behind it. Close your mind's eye for a moment and picture ancient Egypt, and one image will almost certainly rise before you. The dark, elegant line around the eye, sweeping outward, deepening the gaze into something striking and unforgettable. It stares out from tomb walls and painted coffins, from statues and golden masks, so familiar that we hardly question it. We assume without thinking that it was makeup, decoration, a matter of beauty and vanity, and it was that. But it was also, quietly, a good deal more, and the more is where the real interest lies. Consider the eyes themselves in such a land. The sun blazed off pale sand and bright water, dust moved through the dry air, and insects gathered near the face. Dark eye paint may have helped with glare, and laboratory studies of some ancient lead-based compounds suggest antimicrobial activity. Yet the degree of protection experienced in daily life remains uncertain. What is safer to say is that eye paint joined appearance, custom, belief, and practical care in a single familiar gesture. So here we meet a soft correction to a comfortable myth. We tend to imagine that eye paint in ancient Egypt was like so much cosmetic care in our own time, chiefly about appearance, a matter of looking well. The reality seems to have been more layered. The painted eye was beautiful, yes, but it was also useful, shielding and perhaps protecting in a climate that pressed hard upon the body. Beauty and function were braided together so closely that pulling them apart, as we instinctively do, may misread what it meant to the people who wore it. To them, perhaps, there was no contradiction at all. What makes this all the more striking is how widely the painted eye was worn. This was not the mark of a narrow elite, not the privilege of queens alone. Men wore it, women wore it. Children, too, seem to have had their eyes lined, small faces marked with the same dark care. Across the divisions of wealth and status that separated Egyptian lives so sharply in other ways, the lined eye appears again and again, a shared feature that crossed the boundaries between the great house and the humble home. The materials and their fineness would differ, but the practice itself reached broadly through society. We should stay careful, as always. Much of what survives comes to us through art and through the graves of those who could afford to be remembered, and these sources have their biases. The precise reasons Egyptians themselves gave for lining their eyes, the balance they struck in their own minds between beauty, protection, and belief, is not always easy to recover. We reconstruct it from images, from the residues in old cosmetic pots, from scattered writings. What we can say is that the painted eye clearly mattered and that it served more than one purpose at once. There is something quietly appealing in that blurring of purpose, a thing that was at once useful and beautiful, protective and expressive. Worn by the powerful and the ordinary alike, it resists our modern habit of sorting everything into neat categories, the practical here and the decorative there. In the painted eye, these things live together comfortably, part of a single gesture repeated each morning across an entire society. But to understand the painted eye more fully, we must ask what it was actually made from. What were these dark and green substances, ground and mixed and stored in their little pots? Where did they come from, and how were they prepared? The line around the eye began as raw mineral patiently transformed by careful hands. So from the meaning of the painted eye, we turn now to its substance, to kohl and malachite and the ground colours that made it possible. The dark line around the eye did not begin as anything soft or refined. It began as stone. The colours that Egyptians pressed around their eyes were drawn from minerals, dug from the earth and carried sometimes over long distances to be transformed by patient hands into something fine enough to touch to the skin. Chief among them were two. There was malachite, a green mineral that gave a soft, earthy colour used especially in earlier times. And there was galena, a grey-black lead ore that produced the deep, dark line we most often picture, the substance behind what is commonly called kohl. These minerals arrived as hard lumps, useless as they were. To become a cosmetic, they had to be ground and ground finely. This was the quiet, patient work at the heart of it all. The mineral was placed upon a small grinding stone or pallet and worked with another stone until it broke down into a fine powder, smooth enough not to scratch the delicate skin around the eye. It was slow work requiring care and attention, for a gritty, poorly ground powder would be uncomfortable and even harmful. Sometimes the powder was mixed with a little water or oil to help it hold and apply. The making of the colour was itself a small craft. Once ground, the precious powder had to be kept, and here the objects themselves become quietly beautiful. Kohl was stored in little pots and tubes, small vessels made of stone, pottery, wood, or other materials, often with narrow openings suited to holding fine powder. Many of these have survived, and they are among the most touching objects this world has left us. To apply the colour, a slender stick, sometimes of wood, sometimes of ivory or bone or metal, was moistened, dipped into the powder, and drawn carefully along the edge of the eye. These small tools and containers were treasured possessions, kept close, sometimes finely made, sometimes plain. And here, once more, we find the gentle contrast that runs through all of this world. In a wealthy home, the kohl might be exceptionally finely ground, stored in an elegant pot of carved stone or polished wood, applied with a smooth stick of ivory. The whole set spoke of means and care, but in a humbler household the colour might be coarser, ground less patiently, kept in a simple clay pot, applied with a plain wooden stick worn smooth by use. The line around the eye could look much the same from a little distance, but the substance behind it, and the vessels that held it, revealed a great deal about a person's place in the world. We should keep our caution close here as well. The fine kohl pots that fill our museums tended to belong to those who could afford them, and to survive in the protected setting of a tomb. The everyday vessels of the poor, cheap and much used, were less likely to be preserved or admired. So our picture leans, once again, toward the comfortable and the elite. The humble versions existed in far greater numbers than the survival suggest, but they have largely slipped away, leaving the fine examples to stand, a little misleadingly, for the whole. Still, whether fine or coarse, the process was the same in its essence. Stone became powder, became a line of colour drawn with care around the eye. There is something quietly satisfying in tracing that transformation, in seeing how a hard grey lump from the earth was patiently turned into one of the most recognisable features of an entire civilization. Behind the beauty lay grinding, mixing, and the steady work of ordinary hands. But grinding the colour and storing it in its little pot was only the beginning. The real moment came when a person sat down, dipped the slender stick, and lifted it toward their own eye. This was a small act of concentration, of steadiness, often performed before a polished mirror in the quiet of the morning. So from the substance of the colour we turn now to that intimate moment, to the person seated before the mirror, drawing the line with a careful hand. There is a stillness that comes over a person about to line their own eye. The breath holds for a moment. The hand steadies. The whole of one's attention narrows to the fine point of the stick and the delicate edge of the eyelid, where the slightest tremor would smudge the line or sting the eye. In the quiet of an Egyptian morning, this was a small daily act of concentration, repeated so often that the hands surely knew it by feeling as much as by sight. And often, at the centre of the moment, was a mirror, catching the soft light and returning a person's own face to them. The finest mirrors were made of polished metal, most often bronze, worked to a smooth, reflective sheen, and sometimes set into a beautifully carved handle. To hold such a mirror was to hold something of real value, a possession that spoke of comfort and means. In its dim golden surface, a person could see themselves well enough to guide the slender stick along the eye, dipping it into the little pot of ground colour and drawing the line with care. The image it returned was softer than what we know from glass, a warm and slightly shadowed reflection, but it was enough. It let a person tend to their own face with precision and quiet pride. But we must not imagine everyone before a fine metal mirror. Such objects were valuable, and many people may never have owned one. The careful act could instead be guided by practiced fingers or by another person's help. A mother lining a child's eyes, a companion helping a companion, or an attendant tending to the person they served. The mirror was one path to the painted eye, but it was never the only possible one. Here we meet the quiet contrast once more. On one side was the privilege of a polished metal mirror, held in a comfortable room, allowing a person to attend to their reflection in unhurried calm. On the other was the improvisation of ordinary life, practiced fingers, a borrowed hand, or the help of someone familiar with the task. The gesture may have been shared across society, but the tools and assistants available to perform it were not. Whatever the method, there is something touching in the intimacy of the moment. To line the eye was to look closely at oneself, or to be looked at closely by another. It was a small act of readiness, of preparing to meet the day in the eyes of other people. In that quiet pause before the mirror, or beneath the careful gaze of another person, someone composed themselves, drawing the line that would frame how they were seen. It was private and personal, and yet it was aimed outward, toward the world they were about to enter. We should keep our usual caution. The mirrors that survive, like so much else, tend to be the fine ones, preserved in graves and admired in collections. So the objects that remain lean, once again, toward the comfortable few, and we must imagine the rest. What we can say is that the careful lining of the eye seems to have been widely shared, however varied the tools and assistants that made it possible. And once the line was drawn, once the eyes were framed in their soft dark colour, a person carried that face out into the world. The painted eye was not made only for the private mirror, it was made to be seen, to signal something to others in the streets, the markets, the gatherings. So from the intimate moment before the mirror, we turn now to what the painted eye said once a person stepped beyond their own doorway. Once a person stepped beyond their own doorway, their painted eye was no longer a private thing. It entered the shared world of the street, the market, the gathering, where faces met faces and were quietly read. For the painted eye spoke a language, even without words. A carefully lined eye could suggest that a person was healthy, well-tended, in good order. It signalled softly that here was someone who cared for themselves, who had the means and the mindfulness to attend to their appearance. In a world where so much was communicated through how one presented oneself, this small dark line carried meaning outward into the community. To appear with eyes freshly lined was in a gentle way to affirm one's place among others. It was part of being presentable, of belonging, of meeting the expectations that a community held about how a decent, ordered person should look. Much as a clean body signalled respectability, so too did the tended eye. It suggested that a person was participating fully in the shared customs of their world, not neglected, not disordered, but part of things. This was not vanity so much as membership, a quiet way of saying that one belonged. Yet the meaning was never fixed. It shifted with the occasion and with a person's status. For a festival or a religious gathering, the eyes might be lined more richly, the whole appearance heightened to match the importance of the day. For ordinary labour, a plainer line, or none at all, might suit the moment. What the painted eye said depended on when it was worn, and by whom, and in what setting. A noblewoman at a feast and a working woman at the market both might line their eyes, but the message each sent and the fineness of the line could differ considerably. The same gesture carried different weight in different lives. And here we come upon a soft and human contrast. There was surely a kind of social pressure in all of this, an expectation to appear well, to be seen as ordered and cared for, to meet the standards of one's community. But there was also personal comfort, the simple private satisfaction of one's own morning routine, of feeling ready and composed regardless of who was watching. These two things lived side by side. A person might line their eyes partly for others and partly for themselves, and the two motives blurred together, as they still do for us. The eye that pleased the community also, perhaps quietly pleased the one who wore it. We must be especially careful here, more careful than anywhere, about what we can truly claim. Nearly everything that survives to show us the painted eye comes through art and through tombs, through images made to present people at their finest and most idealized. The serene, perfectly lined faces gazing out from coffin lids and painted walls were never meant to show the tired, ordinary reality of daily life. They rarely show us the smudged line at the end of a long day, the face too weary to bother, the poor person who could not always spare the colour. The evidence shows us the ideal, not the everyday, and we should hold that difference gently in mind. So we cannot say precisely how it felt to move through an Egyptian street with lined eyes, how much thought people gave it, how sharply they judged one another by it. We can only say that appearance mattered, that the painted eye was part of how people presented and read one another, and that beneath the social expectation there ran a quieter, more personal thread of self-tending. Both were real, woven together in every lined face that passed through the markets and courtyards of that ancient world. But sight was only one of the senses through which people were known to one another. Long before a person's face came into view, and long after they had passed, something else could mark their presence and linger in memory. That something was scent. So from the eye that others saw, we turn now to the fragrance that others breathed, and to the deep and layered world of perfume in ancient Egypt. Scent arrives before a person does, and it lingers after they have gone. Long before a face came clearly into view along a crowded street, a drift of fragrance might announce that someone was near, and in ancient Egypt this quiet power of scent was understood and cherished deeply. Fragrance moved through this world in ways we can only partly recover now, curling up from temple altars, hanging in the warm air of festivals, clinging softly to skin and linen and hair. To live in Egypt was, in some measure, to live within a landscape of scent, layered and meaningful, and everywhere present. At its highest and most solemn, fragrance belonged to the gods. In the temples, incense was burned as an offering, and its smoke rising upward as a kind of prayer made visible, carrying reverence toward the divine. Sweet-smelling resins and prepared perfumes were part of how the sacred spaces were kept holy and how the gods were honoured. The very air of a temple, thick with the warm scent of burning resin, was meant to feel set apart from the ordinary world, a fragrance that marked the boundary between the everyday and the holy. Scent was not decoration here, it was devotion. But fragrance served humbler purposes too, close to the ground of daily life. In a hot and crowded land, where bodies laboured and gathered and pressed close together, pleasant scent offered relief from the heat and closeness of the day. A fragrant oil worked into the skin, a sweet-smelling preparation, could lift the spirit and soften the harsher smells of ordinary living. Scent made a warm day more bearable, a gathering more pleasant, a person more welcome to be near. In this, fragrance was a small daily comfort, one that eased the body and gladdened the senses in a world that could be hard on both. Here we find the gentle contrast that runs through the whole world of perfume. On one side stood the sacred fragrance of the temple, precious and solemn, offered to the gods with reverence and awe. On the other stood the everyday scents of the ordinary home, simpler and cheaper, meant only to freshen a body or brighten a plain day. The two were made of related things, resins and oils and fragrant plants, but they lived at very different heights of meaning and expense. The same broad language of scent stretched from the altar to the humble doorway, spoken richly by some and plainly by others. For we must remember, as always, that the finest fragrances belong to those who could afford them. The rare and costly perfumes, the deeply scented oils and imported resins, were luxuries of the temple and the wealthy household. Ordinary people made do with simpler, cheaper scents, or with none at all beyond what their plain oils offered. The evidence we have leans, once again, toward the grand and the recorded, the temple inventories and the elite tombs, and tells us far less about the modest fragrances of everyday folk. We should imagine their scents as quieter and plainer, but no less genuine in the small pleasure they gave. Still, whether grand or humble, sacred or everyday, scent clearly mattered to these people in a way that reaches across the centuries to touch us. We know this feeling ourselves, the way a particular fragrance can lift a mood, mark an occasion, or bring a memory rushing back. In ancient Egypt, that quiet power was woven all through life, from the smoke of the temple to the sweetness of a festival evening to the faint fragrance of oil on ordinary skin. Fragrance honored the gods, eased the body, and lingered in memory, doing all of this at once. But where did these fragrances come from? A drop of scented oil, a warm resin, a sweet perfume. None of these appeared on their own. Behind each lay patient labour, the steeping and pressing and blending of flowers and resins and spices in quiet workshops. So from the presence of scent in this world, we turn now to its making, to the slow and skillful craft of the perfumers whose hands filled Egypt with fragrance. A jar of perfume seems, at first, like a simple thing, a pleasant scent dabbed onto skin and soon released into the air. But behind that fleeting fragrance lay patient and skilled work. Many Egyptian scented preparations were made by steeping aromatic plants, resins, seeds, or flowers in oils and fats, allowing the base to absorb their fragrance over time. Methods varied across periods and places, but the work demanded attention, experience, and knowledge passed carefully from one maker to another. The heart of the method was steeping. Fragrant materials, the petals of flowers, sweet resins, aromatic seeds, and spices, were soaked and warmed in oils or animal fats, so that the fats slowly drew the scent out of them and held it. This was done gently, over time, the mixture warmed and the spent materials replaced with fresh ones again and again, layer upon layer, until the oil or fat was richly saturated with fragrance. It was slow work, unhurried by necessity, and a workshop given over to it would have been filled with mingling aromas warm and heavy in the air. Wooden presses squeezed the last scent from petals, and clay vessels held the precious results. The proportions and sequence of ingredients were matters of real skill. Some perfume formulae were associated with temples, specialist workshops, or named preparations, while much practical knowledge must have lived in the hands and memories of makers. Exactly how widely recipes were shared or protected is difficult to know. What is clear is that a fine fragrance depended not only on costly ingredients, but also on judgment, patience, and experience. Here we come upon a quiet contrast worth holding in mind. On one side stood the finished perfume, precious and admired, poured into a fine vessel, worn by the wealthy or offered to the gods, spoken of with pleasure. On the other side stood the making of it, the humble and laborious reality, the long steeping and pressing, the workshop thick with heat and scent, the hands stained and tired from the work. The grand luxury rested entirely upon the patient, unglamorous labour that produced it. The two were bound together, though only one was usually seen or celebrated. And this points us towards something easy to forget. Behind the beautiful things of this world stood the many hands that made them, most of them unnamed and unrecorded. The workers who tended the steeping vessels, who gathered and prepared the flowers, who pressed and strained and poured, are almost entirely lost to us. Their skill was real, their labour essential, and yet history has kept their names far less carefully than it kept the perfumes they made. We should remember, when we imagine a fine fragrance, the quiet workshop behind it, and the people whose work has largely slipped from the record. We must keep our caution here too, for much about ancient perfume making remains uncertain. The methods have been reconstructed from scattered texts, from images, from the residues left in old vessels, and from later accounts that may not perfectly reflect earlier practice. The precise recipes, the exact techniques, the day-to-day reality of the workshops, these we know only in part. What survives leans toward the grand and the celebrated fragrances rather than the humble ones, and toward the finished product rather than the working conditions behind it. We reconstruct the rest with care. Still, the broad shape is clear enough, and quietly moving. Fragrance in ancient Egypt was earned through patience, drawn slowly out of the natural world by skilled and largely forgotten hands. A single jar of perfume held within it many hours of labour and generations of accumulated skill and experience. And some of these precious fragrances found their most vivid use in the great gatherings of the living, at feasts and festivals where scent mingled with music and warmth. So from the making of fragrance we turn now to those festival nights, and to the curious scented cones that Egyptian art so often shows upon the heads of celebrating guests. If you have looked closely at Egyptian paintings of feasts and gatherings, you may have noticed pale cones resting upon the heads of guests. For a long time, scholars debated whether these were literal objects or artistic symbols of fragrance and festivity. Archaeological discoveries at Amarna later showed that real wax cones did exist. Their exact purpose, however, and whether they were normally perfumed, are still not fully known. One older interpretation imagined cones of scented fat slowly melting through the warmth of a feast and releasing perfume over hair and shoulders. The Amana examples confirm that wax cones could be worn, but they do not prove that every painted cone melted in this way or carried fragrance. The safest conclusion is a gentle one. The cones belong to a world of ceremony, identity, and sensory meaning whose details are only partly recoverable. Even without knowing the cone's exact purpose, we can still feel what these images suggest. Both the surviving objects and their painted representations belong to a world of ceremony, presentation, and shared celebration. They appear in scenes of feasting, where guests gathered in fine clothes amid music and food and drink, in the soft glow of lamplight as evening deepened. Garlands hung about the room, cups were filled. The air, we may imagine, was thick with fragrance and the low hum of voices and music. The cones, real or painted, belong to this world of gathered joy, marking an occasion set apart from the ordinary run of days. There is something quietly lovely in that, the picture of people long ago coming together to celebrate, to eat and drink and enjoy fine scents in good company. It is a scene we recognise across the centuries, the universal pleasure of a gathering, of being among others in warmth and ease. The specific customs were theirs alone, strange to our eyes, but the underlying feeling, the wish to mark a happy occasion and share it, belongs to every age. In these festival scenes, ancient Egypt feels suddenly close to us and gently familiar. Yet we should hold the picture with care and remember its edges. Such feasts with their fine fragrances and abundant food are not open to everyone. The lavish gatherings shown in tomb paintings belonged largely to the comfortable and the elite, the households wealthy enough to host and attend them. For the many ordinary people whose labour filled the fields and workshops, the festival night looked different, or did not come at all. While some celebrated in scented rooms, others passed a quiet, plain evening at home, their pleasures smaller and their tables simpler. The abundance of the feast stood against the ordinary quiet of those not among the invited. And there is the further caution that these images were made to honour and idealise, painted upon the walls of tombs to show life at its finest and most joyful. They were never meant to be a plain record of how evenings truly passed. We should read them, then, as glimpses of an ideal, of celebration as the wealthy wish to be remembered enjoying it, rather than as a faithful account of ordinary festival life. The reality behind the paint is harder to see, and much of it is lost to us. Still, the fragrance in these scenes points us onward. For scent in ancient Egypt did not belong only to the living and their feasts. It reached further, into the temples and into the rites surrounding death itself, bridging the world of the living and the realm of the gods and the dead. So from the warmth of the festival night, we turn now to the deeper and more solemn uses of fragrance, to scent as an offering, a preparation and a form of remembrance. The fragrance that drifted through festival halls did not stay among the living. It rose in Egyptian belief towards something higher and more lasting, for scent was understood as a bridge, a thing that could pass between the world of people and the world of the gods and the dead. The sweet smoke of incense curling upward from a temple altar was more than a pleasant smell. It was an offering made visible, a gift to the divine, a way of reaching toward what could not be seen or touched. In the fragrance of the shrine, the earthly and the sacred met and mingled. Within the temples, fragrance was woven into the daily care of the gods themselves. The images of the deities were tended with reverence, anointed with precious oils and surrounded by sweet-smelling resins, much as a beloved living person might be cared for. To offer fragrance to a god was an act of devotion, a way of honouring and pleasing the divine presence. The finest and costliest scents were reserved for this purpose, prepared with care and given freely, for nothing too precious could be offered to the powers that shaped the world. Scent here was a language of worship. But fragrance reached towards another passage too, the most solemn of all. In the preparation of the dead, scented oils and resins played a central part. The body was anointed and treated with fragrant substances as it was made ready for the journey beyond life, and sweet resins were part of the long and careful rites that surrounded death. Fragrance accompanied a person across the threshold from this world into whatever lay ahead, a final act of care laid upon the body by those who tended it. In this, the care of the body and the care of the soul became one and the same gesture. Here we come upon a contrast that is less a tension than a tenderness. On one side stood the grand religious ritual, the great temple rites, the solemn preparation of the dead conducted according to sacred custom. On the other stood something smaller and more intimate, The personal act of caring for a loved one, of anointing a body with fragrance out of grief and devotion, of wishing them well on their journey. The vast machinery of belief and the private ache of loss met in the same fragrant oil, the same careful hands. What was cosmic was also, quietly deeply personal. We must keep our caution close, for the beliefs surrounding death and the gods were not simple, uniform, or unchanging. They varied across the long centuries of Egyptian history, from place to place and from period to period, shifting in their details and emphases, and once more, what survives to tell us of them comes overwhelmingly from the grand tombs of the wealthy and powerful, richly prepared and carefully recorded. The graves of ordinary people, simpler and far more numerous, reveal far less about the fragrances and rites that attended their passing. We should imagine their farewells as humbler, but no less heartfelt. Still, through all the variation and uncertainty, one thread holds steady and touches us across the ages. Fragrance was tied to reverence and to remembrance, to honouring what was loved and holy, whether a god upon an altar or a person laid to rest. The same sweet scent that gladdened a feast could sanctify a temple and accompany a soul into the beyond. In this, the care of the body reached its fullest meaning, extending beyond life itself into the realm of faith and memory. To anoint was in the end to cherish. And so we have followed fragrance from the everyday home to the festival hall, to the temple and the tomb, tracing how deeply scent was woven through this ancient world. But the body was tended in still other ways, and one of the most striking concerned what crowned it. The care of hair, the making of wigs, the meaning held in how a head was kept and covered, all of this formed another rich chapter of Egyptian life. So from the fragrance that clung to hair and skin, we turn now to hair itself, and to the surprising customs that surrounded it. Hair has always carried more meaning than its simple presence would suggest, and in ancient Egypt this was profoundly so. The way a person kept their hair could speak of their age, their status, their cleanliness, their place in the world. A child's hair was often kept differently from an adult's. The styles of the wealthy differed from those of the labourer. Hair was read quietly, the way clothing or a lined eye was read, offering signals about who a person was before a single word was spoken. To tend one's hair or to remove it was never a neutral act in this world. But hair in Egypt was also a very practical concern, and this is easy to forget beneath the elegant images. In a hot land, thick hair could be uncomfortable, trapping heat against the scalp through the long, warm days. Worse, hair harboured lice, a persistent and unpleasant reality of life in close, warm conditions. These were not distant worries, but daily ones, and they shaped how people chose to care for their heads. The management of hair was in part a matter of comfort and hygiene, of keeping cool and keeping clean in a climate and a world that made both a challenge. Faced with these realities, some Egyptians made a striking choice. They shaved their heads, partly or entirely, freeing themselves from the heat and the lice at a stroke. For those who served in the temples especially, this was tied to ideas of purity and cleanliness, the smooth, shaven head marking a body kept scrupulously ordered for sacred duty. Others, meanwhile, kept and styled their natural hair, arranging it, oiling it, tending it with care. Both choices existed side by side, and neither was simply right or wrong. They reflected different needs, different roles, different notions of what a well-kept head should be. Here we meet a gentle contrast that runs through the whole matter of hair. On one side stood the public presentation, the styled hair or the elegant covering arranged to be seen, to signal status and order to the watching world. On the other stood the private practicality. The shaven head kept cool and clean beneath a covering, comfortable and sensible if not always meant for show. A person might live in both at once, practical underneath and presentable above. The plain reality and the polished appearance layered together upon a single head. We should be especially careful here not to universalize, for these choices shifted enormously depending on many things. Class shaped them, and so did occupation, gender, region, and the particular era in which a person lived, since customs changed across the long stretch of Egyptian history. What was fashionable or expected in one century might differ in another. A priest, a noblewoman, a farmer, a child, each stood in a different relationship to their hair, guided by different pressures and possibilities. There was no single Egyptian way with hair, but many, woven through a vast and varied society across many hundreds of years. And as always, our picture is uneven. The elegant hairstyles and shaven heads we know best come largely from art and from the tombs of those who could afford to be remembered finely. The everyday hair care of ordinary people, the plain washing and combing and occasional shaving of a working family has left us far less to study. We reconstruct it carefully, from combs and razors that survive, from scattered images, from what practical sense suggests. What we can say is that hair mattered, and that its care was taken seriously, in its practical and its meaningful dimensions alike. Yet, for those who wished to present styled, elaborate hair without the burden of maintaining it, or who had shaven their own heads for coolness and cleanliness, there was a remarkable solution. Egypt developed a rich art of the wig, crafted with skill and worn with pride, that let a person crown themselves with beauty at will. So from the natural hair upon the head, we turn now to the elaborate and fascinating world of the Egyptian wig and to the skilled hands that made it. The wig offered an elegant answer to a real dilemma. A person might shave their head for coolness and cleanliness, escaping the heat and the lice, and yet still wish to appear, when the occasion called for it, crowned with full and beautifully arranged hair. The wig made both possible at once. It could be set upon the head for a gathering, a feast, or any moment that asked for a fine appearance, and then removed, leaving the cool, clean scalp beneath. In this way, the Egyptians enjoyed the best of both worlds, comfort in private and splendour in public, a practical solution dressed in real beauty. These were not crude coverings, but carefully crafted objects, the work of skilled hands. Wigs were made from human hair and sometimes from plant fibres, worked and arranged with great patience into their finished forms. The hair was fixed and styled, sometimes with the help of beeswax or resin to hold the shape, and built up into arrangements that could be elaborate indeed, full of braids, curls, and careful order. A fine wig might be styled into forms that spoke clearly of wealth and fashion, a crowning display set atop a person's finest appearance. The making of one took time, skill, and a genuine artistry. The wig makers who produced them practiced a real and valued craft. To gather and prepare the hair, to fix and arrange it upon its base, to achieve a style that would hold and please, required knowledge and no small dexterity. We can picture the workshop, the wooden stands upon which wigs were shaped and stored, the strands of hair laid ready, the faint sheen of beeswax, the comb moving through the fibres in the working light. Behind every fine wig worn to a feast stood these patient makers, whose skill turned loose hair into an object of beauty and status. Theirs was a quiet trade, essential to the appearance of the well-dressed. Here we find the contrast that runs by now familiarly through so much of Egyptian body care. A fine, elaborate wig was a costly thing, the mark of the wealthy, who might own several for different occasions. Such a person could crown themselves richly whenever they wished, changing their appearance as the moment required. But for humbler people, the elaborate wig lay well out of reach. They made do with simpler versions, plainer and cheaper, or wore their natural hair, or covered their heads with a plain cloth, or went with nothing elaborate at all. The wish to appear well was widely shared. The means to do so with a splendid wig were not. We should keep our caution close as ever. The magnificent wigs that survive, admired now in museum cases, tended to belong to those wealthy enough to own and be buried with them, preserved in the protected quiet of fine tombs. The simple coverings of ordinary people, worn out through use and made of humbler stuff, have largely vanished, leaving little behind. So our picture leans, once again, toward the grand and the elite, and we must imagine the plainer reality that surrounded it, the many modest heads for every richly wigged one that survives. Still, the broad truth is a warm one. The Egyptians met a genuine problem, the heat and discomfort of hair in their climate, with a solution that was at once practical and beautiful. The wig let comfort and splendour coexist, and it gave rise to a real craft, tended by skilled hands whose work crowned the appearances of the well-dressed. Whether fine or simple, the covering of the head was another way that people tended themselves and presented themselves to the world. And a well-arranged head, whether of natural hair or a fine wig, was often not left plain. It was crowned further with adornment, with beads and bands and glittering ornaments, and the body too was hung with jewellery that was beautiful and meaningful at once. So from the crafting of the wig, we turn now to the adornment of the body, to the jewellery and amulets that the Egyptians wore for beauty and for protection alike. A well-arranged head and a cared-for body were seldom left unadorned in ancient Egypt. Around the neck, upon the wrists and fingers, At the ears and ankles, the Egyptians hung ornaments that caught the light and pleased the eye. Beads strung on cords, rings upon the fingers, broad collars laid across the shoulders, small amulets worn close to the skin. Jewellery was everywhere in this world, part of how a person completed their appearance and presented themselves. But it would be a mistake to think of it, as we so often think of jewellery now, as mere decoration. In Egypt, adornment carried a second and deeper purpose alongside its beauty. For much Egyptian jewellery was also protective, believed to guard the wearer against harm and to invite good fortune and health. Amulets in particular were worn for their power as much as their appearance. Small charms shaped into meaningful forms, each thought to offer its own kind of safeguard. To wear such an object was to carry a measure of protection with you through the dangers and uncertainties of life. Beauty and belief were woven together here, just as they were in the painted eye, so that a single ornament might please the eye and shield the soul at once. The lovely thing was also the powerful thing. The materials of adornment ranged widely, and in that range a person's place in the world was written plainly. At the highest end gleamed gold, worked into broad collars and fine ornaments, the shining mark of wealth and status, buried with kings and nobles and dazzling still across the centuries. Below the gold came other precious and semi-precious materials, and then, within reach of far more people, there was faience, that lovely glazed material fired to a deep blue or green, made into beads and small charms that ordinary folk could hope to own. The humble faience bead and the golden collar sat at opposite ends of a single, shared human impulse. Here lies the gentle contrast at the heart of adornment. The grand golden collar of a noble, heavy and radiant, spoke of enormous wealth and lofty station. The single humble bead or small faience amulet of a poor person spoke of far less means, and yet in what mattered most, it may have carried just as much. For the hope pressed into a modest protective charm, the wish for safety and good fortune worn against the skin, was every bit as heartfelt as any noble's. A poor mother's amulet for her child held as much love and yearning as the finest jewelled collar ever did. The materials divided people sharply, the feeling behind them did not. We should keep our familiar caution. The magnificent jewellery that fills our museums and our imaginations tended to belong to the wealthy and was preserved in their fine tombs, gleaming and remarkable and unrepresentative. The simple beads and cheap charms of ordinary people were more easily lost, broken, or overlooked, though they existed in far greater numbers. So the surviving splendour tells us once again chiefly about the few, and we must picture the many humbler ornaments that surrounded them, worn by countless people whose names and hopes have slipped away. Still, across every level of this world, the truth holds warm and clear. To adorn the body was to make it beautiful and to keep it safe, to please the eye and to comfort the anxious heart. Whether gold or faience, grand or humble, the ornament worn against the skin joined the long list of ways the Egyptians tended and cherished the body, adding meaning and protection to beauty. A single bead could hold a whole world of care within it, and that thought of how much meaning a small object could carry invites us to pause. For scattered across time these little things have survived, a bead here, a comb there, a worn cosmetic pot, each once part of a living hand and a daily routine. So from the adornment of the body, we turn now to a quieter reflection, to what a single small surviving object can tell us about the ordinary life that once held it. Let us pause now and hold in our minds a single small object. Not a golden mask, not a royal collar, but something humble and ordinary. A comb of wood, its teeth worn from years of use. A single faience bead, its glaze faded to a soft blue. A little cosmetic pot, chipped at the rim, still faintly stained with the colour it once held. Such things sit quietly in museum cases now, behind glass, catching the soft light. They're easy to walk past. And yet, if we stop before one of them, it can open a whole world. For a small object like this was once part of a living hand and a daily routine. That worn comb was drawn through someone's hair, morning after morning, until its teeth smoothed with use. That chip pot was reached for at dawn, its colour lifted onto a slender stick and drawn around a waking eye. These were not treasures in their own time, not things meant to be admired or remembered. They were the ordinary furniture of ordinary lives, used until they broke or were set aside, and then, by some quiet accident of survival, they came down to us. In their very plainness lies their power to move us. Here we find perhaps the softest contrast of our whole journey, Grand history remembers the kings, the great monuments, the names carved in stone to outlast the centuries. But a single worn comb speaks of something history rarely records: the daily life of an ordinary person, the small repeated gestures that filled their days. The pyramid tells us about power. The chipped coal pot tells us about a morning, a face, a habit, a human being much like ourselves. And in a strange way, the small object can bring us closer to the past than the great one ever could, because it speaks the language of everyday life that we ourselves still speak. There is a quiet tenderness in this, to look at a worn comb and understand that hands like our own once held it, that someone once cared enough about their appearance to draw it through their hair each day, is to feel the distance of the centuries suddenly narrow. The person is gone, their name unknown, their story untold. But the object remains, bearing the faint fingerprints of a life, a small and silent witness to a routine much like the ones we perform ourselves. Across all the years between, the human wish to be cared for and presentable reaches out and touches us through such things. We must keep our caution gently, even here. Objects survive unevenly, and that unevenness shapes what we can know. The things of the wealthy, preserved in fine tombs, come down to us in far greater number and finer condition than the belongings of the poor. The humblest lives left the faintest traces of all, their cheap and much-used possessions worn away or discarded, rarely thought worth keeping. So even our small surviving objects lean, once more, toward those who had a little more. The poorest people slip almost entirely from view, remembered by almost nothing at all. We should hold that absence in mind and imagine the many lives that left no trace. Still, what does survive is enough to fill us with quiet wonder. A single small thing, a bead, a comb, a little pot, can carry an entire vanished world of daily habit and gentle care. It reminds us that history is not made only of the great and the powerful, but of countless ordinary people who woke and washed and tended themselves and lived their days as best they could. And every one of those small objects was at some point held and used by a living hand. But behind these hands that used the combs and pots and beads stood other hands as well, the ones that carried the water, warmed the oil and made the beauty possible. So from the object in the case, we turn now to the people themselves, to the servants and workers whose quiet labour lay behind so much of the care we have followed. Behind every anointed body and every finely arranged wig, there were hands we rarely see. In the comfortable households we have wandered through, the warm oil did not warm itself, the water did not carry itself, the wig did not arrange itself upon the head. Someone fetched, someone prepared, someone tended. Servants and attendants and hired workers stood behind much of the care we have followed, doing the quiet labour that made another person's comfort possible. Their hands were everywhere in this story, and yet their names have almost entirely slipped away, unrecorded and unremembered. Picture for a moment the person who rose before their household to draw the water for the morning wash, who warmed the oil between their palms before smoothing it onto another's skin, who combed and arranged the hair, who ground the kohl to a fine powder, who kept the little pots in order and the linens fresh. These were real people with lives and bodies of their own, and their days were spent in the service of others' well-being. The gentle rituals we have admired, the slow anointing, the careful lining of the eye, often depended on someone else's steady, unnoticed work. And here we must hold a quiet contrast honestly and without looking away. There was the comfort of the one who was served, reclining while warm oil was smoothed onto tired shoulders, rising to find the water drawn and the day made ready. And there was the labour of the one who served, whose own morning began earlier and ended later, whose hands did the work that made another's ease possible. The same room held both the comfort and the labour, the tended and the tender side by side. We should not let the softness of the ritual hide the effort that underlay it. This does not mean we must picture only hardship, nor imagine these lives as nothing but suffering. The relationships between the served and those who served them varied greatly, and we cannot assume they were all the same, all harsh or all kind. Some attendants may have held positions of trust and a measure of security, valued for their skill and closeness. Others surely laboured under far heavier burdens, with little comfort of their own. The truth, as always, was varied and human, and we should hold both possibilities gently, resisting the urge to flatten these lives into a single story. What we can say is that their work deserves to be seen and their dignity honoured. There is a quiet nobility in the labour of caring for another, in the hands that warm the oil and draw the water and tend the body. It is work as old as humanity and as valuable as any, and yet it is precisely the kind of work that history has recorded most faintly. The great are remembered by name and monument. Those who served them are remembered, if at all, only in passing, a figure in the corner of a painting, an unnamed presence behind a celebrated life. We should pause, at least, to acknowledge them. We must keep our caution close, for these are among the hardest lives to reconstruct. What we know of servants and attendants comes largely through the records and images of those they served, the wealthy and powerful who commissioned the art and left the writings. The inner experience of the servant, their own feelings about their work and their days, is almost entirely lost to us. We glimpse them only through the eyes of others, and we should remember how partial and one-sided that glimpse must be. Much of their world lies beyond our reach, and yet these serving hands were only part of the wider world of work that made beauty possible. Beyond the household, the workshops and markets, another set of hands laboured, the makers and sellers who crafted the oils, the wigs, the beads, and carried them through the bustling markets of the land. So from those who served within the home, we turn now to those who made and traded the goods of beauty beyond it. Beyond the quiet of the household, out in the wider world, another set of hands was busy with the goods of beauty. Someone had to make the oils and pack them into their jars, to craft the wigs upon their wooden stands, to string the beads and shape the little charms, to blend the perfumes in their warm workshops. And someone had to carry all of these things to the places where people could obtain them, to trade and barter and sell. Together, these makers and merchants formed a quiet economy of beauty, a web of skill and exchange that kept the oils flowing and the ornaments changing hands across the land. The markets were the beating heart of this exchange. Picture the stalls set out beneath the midday sun, the jars of oil stacked in careful rows, the beads laid out to catch the light, the haggling voices and the shuffle of feet in the dust. Here the perfumer's careful work met the buyer's wish. Here a wig or a string of beads passed from maker to wearer. Goods moved too along the river, that great highway of Egypt, carried by boat from place to place, so that a fragrant resin or a fine material might travel far from where it began. The world of beauty was in part a world of trade, of things moving and changing hands. The people behind this trade practiced real and valued skills, the perfume makers with their guarded recipes, the wig makers with their patient artistry, the bead stringers and charm makers with their nimble fingers, the traders who knew the worth of things and where to find them. Theirs was genuine expertise, built through practice and often passed along within families or workshops. A skilled maker's work was sought after, and a fair reputation carried real value in a world where quality was judged by eye and hand. These were not idle occupations, but crafts that people depended upon and respected. Yet here too lies a familiar contrast, quiet and worth holding. There were no doubt grand networks of trade, precious materials carried over great distances, wealthy merchants dealing in fine goods and fragrances. And there was, at the other end, the small daily reality of a single seller at a single stall offering modest wares to ordinary buyers, earning a plain living through steady, unglamorous work. The vast trade routes and the humble market stall were both part of the same world, but they were lived very differently. Behind the grand movement of goods stood countless small sellers whose days were far more ordinary than grand. And the rewards of this world were unevenly shared, as rewards so often are. The prosperous merchant and the successful workshop might do well, gathering wealth and standing. The humble maker or small seller earned far less, labouring for a modest return, their profits thin and their recognition thinner still. The skill might be real at every level, but the reward for it depended greatly on one's place, one's means, one's fortune. Some grew comfortable through the trade in beauty. Many others simply got by, their labour essential yet barely rewarded, their names never written down. We should keep our caution close, for much of this world is hard to see clearly. What we know of trade and craft comes from scattered records, from images, from the objects that survived, and these tend to favour the prosperous and the organised over the humble market seller scraping out a living. The day-to-day reality of the small trader, the exact way goods were priced and bartered, the ordinary lives of the makers, these we know only in fragments. We reconstruct the picture carefully, aware that it leans, once more, toward those who left the clearest trace. Still, Whether grand or humble, all this labour shared one thing in common. It filled the days of those who did it, from the first light until the sun began to lower, and when at last the day's work was done, the makers and sellers, like the servants and like all of Egypt, turned toward home and rest. So from the busy world of the market, we turn now to the quiet threshold where work ends and evening begins, shared across every station of life. There comes, in every working day, a moment when the sun begins to lower and the labour draws to its close. In ancient Egypt, this was a threshold felt by nearly everyone, from the servant in the great house to the seller folding away their stool, from the perfumer stopping the last steeping to the field worker straightening a tired back. The light softened and lengthened. The heat began, at last, to ease. And across the land, hands that had worked since dawn began, one by one, to set down their tools and turn toward home. It was a shared moment, this quiet turning felt in countless lives at once. Picture the market as the day wound down, the stalls being packed away, the last goods gathered up, the voices growing fewer as sellers and buyers drifted homeward. Picture the workshop falling quiet, the presses stilled, the vessels sealed and set aside until morning. Picture the streets beginning to empty, the shutters closing, the first evening lamps being lit within the houses as the sky outside deepened toward dusk. There is a particular peace in this hour, the peace of work completed, of a day's demands finally laid down. It is a peace that people have known in every age, and the Egyptians knew it too. Here we find a gentle contrast, and a comforting one. There was the hardship of the long workday, the hours of labour beneath the strong sun, the aching muscles and weary hands, the sheer effort of making a living in a demanding world. And there was, at the end of it, the small comfort of its ending, the relief of stopping, of turning toward home and rest. The two belonged together, the toil and the release, and the sweetness of the evening was made deeper by the difficulty of the day behind it. To rest well, one must first have laboured, and the tired body knows the worth of stopping. There is something quietly unifying in this daily rhythm. The great divisions of Egyptian life of wealth and status and station were real and deep, and we have felt them all through our journey. But the turning of work toward rest was a rhythm shared across them all. The wealthy and the humble alike moved through their days and came, at last, to evening. The setting sun did not ask a person's rank before it lowered. In this simple human pattern of labour and its ending, all of Egypt was for a moment joined in a common experience, however different their days had been. And yet we must not let the peace of the image hide the differences that remained. Not every tired body found the same ease waiting at home. Some returned to comfortable houses, to prepared food and soft resting places, to hands ready to tend them. Others came home to crowded rooms, to plain fare, to the same hard mat night after night, their rest as modest as their means. The threshold of evening was shared, but what lay beyond it varied greatly, shaped by all the inequalities we have traced. The relief of stopping was universal. The comfort of what came after was not. We should keep our familiar caution, for the ordinary evenings of ordinary people are among the hardest things to recover. What survives tells us more of the grand household's leisure than of the labourer's plain rest, more of the ideal than of the everyday. We imagine these evenings carefully from what we know of homes and habits, aware that much is lost. What we can say is that the day did end, that work did cease, and that people turned towards whatever rest their lives allowed. And in that turning toward home, the care of the body returned once more. Just as the morning had begun with water and oil, so the evening often closed with them, a final tending before sleep. So from the ending of the working day we turn now toward the evening itself, toward the quiet rituals of nightfall and the gentle approach of rest. And so we come, gently, to the evening. The day that began with a small warm jar of oil now draws toward its close, and in many Egyptian homes the body was tended one last time before rest. There is a lovely symmetry in this, the way the day opened and closed with the same simple acts of care. As the light faded and the lamps were lit, hands reached once more for the water and the oil, not to prepare for the world now, but to wash the world away. The morning ritual had readied a person to go out. The evening ritual welcomed them back into themselves. Picture the quiet of it. The dust and sweat of the long day rinsed from the skin with cool water poured from a jug, the tired body eased and cleaned. Then the oil, warmed a little as it had been at dawn, worked slowly into skin that the sun had dried and roughened through the hours of labour. A soft linen cloth, the dim and steady glow of a single lamp, the deepening dusk pressing gently at the doorway. In this closing ritual the body was soothed and the day was set down. It was a small tending, but a meaningful one, marking the passage from the demands of the day into the peace of the night. There was comfort in the repetition, in knowing that whatever the day had held, the evening would bring this familiar gentleness. The cracked hands would be eased, the sunburned shoulders would be softened, the self worn by the world would be quietly restored. This was care turned inward, care as rest rather than preparation, and there is something deeply soothing in the thought of it, this ancient echo of the way we ourselves wind down at the end of a long day, tending to our tired bodies before we sleep. The evening ritual, of course, looked different across different lives, as everything in this world did. In a comfortable household, it might be slow and elaborate, the water warmed, fragrant oils chosen with care, perhaps another's hands to help, the whole unfolding in unhurried ease by good lamplight. There was time here, and means, and gentle attention. The evening tending could be a genuine pleasure, a leisurely close to the day savoured rather than rushed. For those with such comfort the night arrived softly and well, but in a humbler home the evening wash was plainer and quicker, shaped by tiredness and by limited means. A simple rinse of cool water, a modest rub of plain oil into aching hands and feet by the light of a small lamp before sleep took over. There was less ceremony here, less leisure, but the essential gesture was the same. The tired labourer easing their worn body before rest was performing, in his own plain way, the very same act as the wealthy in their fine rooms, and the simple wash carried every bit as much quiet dignity as the elaborate one. The care was real, whatever its form. Here, then, is our gentle contrast once more, softened now by the hour. The elaborate evening of the comfortable, slow and fragrant and eased by helping hands, stood beside the simple evening of the modest home, quick and plain and lit by a single flame. The means differed greatly, as they always had, but the wish beneath them was one and the same, the wish to be clean, to be soothed, to lay down the day and be at peace before sleep. Rich and poor alike, in their different ways, tended themselves toward the coming night. We should hold our familiar caution even here, for the private evenings of ordinary people are among the quietest things in all of history, leaving the faintest trace. We reconstruct them from objects and from gentle inference, aware that much is lost to us. What we can say is that the day closed as it had opened, with water and oil and the simple tending of the body toward rest. And once the body was washed and eased, there remained only the last thing, the turning towards sleep itself. So from the evening ritual, we move now to the sleeping spaces of the household and to the quiet places where the tired body finally lay down. The body washed, the oil worked into tired skin, there remained only the last and gentlest act of the day, the lying down to rest. Let us move now, softly, into the sleeping spaces of the Egyptian household, into the quiet rooms where the day was finally surrendered to the night. The lamp burned low. The air, which had been so hot through the long day, began at last to cool, and in the dim and settling house, a person made ready to lie down and let sleep come. It is a moment we know well ourselves, this final easing into rest, and it belonged to them as fully as it belongs to us. The places of sleep varied, as everything did, with a person's means. In many ordinary homes, people slept upon woven mats laid on the floor, or on low platforms, simple and plain, close to the cool earth of the mudbrick house. In more comfortable households there were beds, low wooden frames sometimes fitted with woven or corded surfaces, raised a little from the ground, more restful for the body. These were the furniture of sleep, humble or fine, the quiet resting places toward which the whole long day had been slowly bending. And there is one small object here that may surprise us, a thing that speaks tenderly of how far their world was from ours, and yet how alike the wish behind it. Many Egyptians slept not with soft pillows beneath their heads, but with headrests, curved supports of wood or stone that cradled the neck as they lay. To us they look hard and strange, uncomfortable even, and yet they were made and used with care, shaped to hold the head through the night. Whatever their comfort, they served the same purpose our pillows serve, the simple support of a resting head, the small easing of the body into sleep. Here we meet our familiar contrast, quiet now and almost tender in the dark. There was the fine bed of the comfortable household, raised and fitted and eased with care, and there was the simple mat of the modest home, laid upon the floor for a tired body to sink onto at last. The difference in comfort was real as it had been all day and all through this story, and yet as the lamps went out across the land, something united every one of these resting places, the wish for safe rest, for the day to be over, for sleep to come gently belonged to rich and poor alike, felt in every home along the darkening street. There is a deep and quiet tenderness in a sleeping house, the day's labour laid down, the voices stilled, the small sounds of night settling over the rooms, the soft breathing of those at rest, the last faint glow of a dying lamp, the cool air moving gently through the doorway. Across the whole land, as darkness deepened, house after house fell into this same quiet, the great and the humble alike given over to sleep. The divisions that ran so sharply through waking life softened in the dark, until every sleeping household held the same simple peace, the same trust that the night would keep them until morning. We should hold our caution gently, as ever, even now. The fine beds and carved headrests that survive come mostly from the tombs of those who could afford them, while the simple mats of the poor have largely vanished, leaving little to study. Our picture of sleep, like so much else, leans toward the comfortable few. We imagine the humbler rest carefully, aware that much of it is lost. But the essential truth remains that people lay down and were still and slept, as people always have. And as the sleeping house grows quiet around us, our thoughts may drift wider, beyond this single night toward the whole span of a life. For the care of the body we have followed through this one day was, in truth, the care of a lifetime, accompanying a person from their first days to their last. So from the quiet of the sleeping house, we turn now to gently reflect on how this tending wove through an entire human life. As the sleeping house settles into stillness, let our thoughts drift a little wider, beyond this single day toward the whole of a life. For the care of the body that we have followed from dawn to dusk was never only the matter of one morning or one evening. It was the quiet companion of an entire lifetime, present from a person's first days to their very last, and even, in Egyptian belief, beyond. The small gestures we have gathered, the oiling, the washing, the lining of the eye, the tending of hair, were repeated across the years, woven so deeply into living that they became almost invisible, and yet they were always there. Think of how this care began in the earliest days of a life. A child's skin was oiled against the sun, its small eyes perhaps lined like those of the adults around it, its body tended by a mother's or a caretaker's hands. From the very start, a person was folded into these rhythms of care, learning them long before they could remember learning anything at all. The gestures were passed down hand to hand and generation to generation, so that the tending of the body was among the first languages a person came to know, spoken over them before they could speak it themselves. And so it continued, through the long middle of a life, through the years of work and family, of labour and gathering, the daily care went on, a steady thread running beneath everything else. The same reaching for the oil jar at dawn, the same rinse of cool water, the same small attentions repeated through youth and into age. As the body changed, as the hands grew weathered and the skin more lined, the care adapted but did not cease. The aging person tended themselves as they always had, or was tended by others, the gestures familiar and worn smooth by a lifetime of repetition. Even at the end, this care did not stop. We have already touched gently on how the body was anointed and tended in the rites of death, prepared with fragrant oils for whatever the Egyptians believed lay beyond. And so the tending of the body, begun in a person's first days, reached all the way to their last and past them, a final act of care laid upon them by loving or dutiful hands. From the child oiled against the sun to the body prepared for its journey onward, the same essential impulse ran unbroken, the wish to tend, to soothe, to honour the human form. Here is a contrast worth resting in, softly, as we near the end. Set against the grand span of an entire lifetime, each single act of care seems almost nothing at all, a moment's oiling, a morning's washing, gone as soon as it is done. And yet it was precisely these small, fleeting gestures, repeated day upon day, that wove together into the fabric of a whole life. The vastness of a lifetime was built, in the end from countless tiny acts of tending, each one small and forgettable, all of them together forming the quiet dignity of a life cared for from beginning to end. We must, of course, hold our caution close, for lives varied enormously, and much of them lies beyond our knowing. How each life unfolded depended deeply on class, on place, on health and fortune and the particular era in which it was lived. Some lives were long and comfortable, others short and hard. The care available to a person shifted with all these things, and the ordinary experience of most lives has left us only the faintest traces. We reconstruct the shape of it carefully and gently, aware of how much has slipped away into silence. Yet through all the difference and all the loss, something steady remains, and it is this that draws us toward our close. The wish to care for the body, to tend it with dignity across the whole of a life, was profoundly human, and it belonged to them as it belongs to us. So from the arc of an Egyptian life, we turn now, at the last, to the thread that connects those distant lives to our own, and to the quiet river that has carried it all through the long years between. And so we return, at the last, to where we began, to the Nile in the quiet of nightfall. The river that opened our story flows on now beneath a darkening sky, its surface catching the last soft light and the first faint gleam of the moon. Along its banks the houses have fallen still. The lamps are burning low or have gone out. The land that woke at dawn with a small warm jar of oil has settled now into the deep quiet of the night, and the great river slides past it all, as it has done for longer than any memory can reach. It is the same river that carried their days, and it flows still. We have wandered far through this single day, you and I. We began with the cool of a stone floor and the warming of oil between two hands. We followed the meaning of cleanliness, the care of sun-worn skin, the painted eye, the world of fragrance, the tending of hair, the small beauty of adornment. We paused before a worn comb behind museum glass. We honoured the quiet hands that served and made and sold, and we came, at last, through the ending of the workday and the gentle evening ritual to the sleeping house in the whole soft span of a life. It has been a slow and unhurried journey, and now it draws gently to its close. There is nothing new to tell you now, no last fact to add, no final discovery. There is only the quiet settling of all we have gathered, like dust drifting slowly down through still evening air. For the thread that has run through all of it, from the first jar of oil to the last, is a simple and human one. It is the wish to be cared for, the wish to feel clean and soothed and ready, the wish to tend the body with a little dignity and to be tended in return. That wish belonged to them along that ancient river, and it belongs to us as well, tonight, wherever we happen to be. Think for a moment of how little the heart of it has changed. They reached at the end of a long day for water and oil to ease their tired bodies before sleep, and we, in our own way, do the very same. The particulars are different. The centuries lie thick between us, and yet the gesture is recognizably ours. When you tend to yourself tonight, when you let the day fall away and settle toward rest, you're echoing something very old, something those distant people along the Nile would have understood without a word. Across all the years between, the human wish to be at peace before sleep has flowed on, unbroken. Here, then, is our last and gentlest contrast, the distance and the closeness held together. Those lives are impossibly far from us, lived thousands of years ago, their names forgotten, their world long vanished into sand and silence. And yet, in this one quiet thing, they are near. The tired body eased before rest, the small comfort at the end of the day, the turning towards sleep in a darkened house. These join us to them across all that distance. What separates us is vast. What connects us is small and simple and enough. So let the river carry it all now softly into the night. Let the lamps go out one by one along the ancient bank and in your own room too. There is nothing left to do, nothing left to know, only the quiet and the cool of the deepening night and the slow and steady flow of the water in the dark. The day is over, theirs and ours alike, and rest has come at last. Sleep gently now. The same river that carried them is carrying you too, on and on, through the quiet into the soft and waiting dark. Let your breath slow, let the day drift away, and let yourself at last be still.